All right, let's dive into this whole fair housing thing, specifically how this low-income housing tax credit program is shaking things up.
Yeah, the LIHTC.
If you're thinking tax credits, what do those have to do with segregation? Well, you're in for a ride.
It's a wild world out there, right?
Yeah.
So LIHTC, basically the biggest federal program we've got to create affordable housing.
Okay.
But, unlike the old school big government programs like public housing, this one's all market driven.
Okay. So less direct government, but still huge impact.
Huge impact developers get those tax breaks to build low-income units.
Sounds like a recipe for legal battles.
It is. It is.
What were some of the early challenges that came up with LAHTC and fair housing?
Well, think back to before LEHTC, most of those fair housing cases, they were all about federal programs like public housing.
Right.
Like you had that big case, Gotro in Chicago.
Uh-huh.
Courts basically forced housing authorities to build in less segregated areas.
So a more direct approach to tackling segregation.
Right. Tackling it head on, the feds were the main target.
Yeah. But even those cases had their limits. They often just zeroed in on specific projects,
Right.
instead of trying to desegregate whole metropolitan areas.
Makes sense. And I imagine proving intentional discrimination was tough too.
Oh, incredibly tough.
Yeah.
And then you have local control, suburbs pushing back. It's hard to force change when communities are digging in their heels.
Absolutely.
And then LIHTC comes along,
Okay.
run by states, not the feds directly.
Well,
New players at the table, and suddenly states are in the legal hot seat in a way they weren't before.
That's a big shift. So this state-run program really changed the landscape of fair housing lawsuits.
Oh, absolutely it did.
Yeah.
And there's this groundbreaking case in Texas that really shows this Inclusive
yeah.
Communities Project, or ICP.
Got it.
They sued the state's housing finance agency, and their argument, it wasn't about intentional discrimination. It was all about disparate impact.
Disparate impact. Break that down for us.
Imagine a company, right, with this hiring policy.
Yeah.
You have to be over 6 feet tall to work there?
Sounds neutral, right? Doesn't mention race or gender.
Yeah.
But statistically, women are on average shorter than men.
Right.
So this neutral policy, it would probably end up hiring way fewer women.
Interesting.
That's disparate impact in a nutshell. Policies that seem neutral but have a discriminatory effect.
Okay, so in the Texas case, ICP was arguing that the way the state was giving out those tax credits, even if it wasn't intentional,
Right.
was impacting where affordable housing got built in a discriminatory way.
Exactly. They were saying these policies, even without any racist intent, were basically reinforcing segregation by concentrating LIHTC developments in minority neighborhoods.
Gotcha, so it went to the Supreme Court.
All the way to the Supreme Court, yeah. And in a landmark decision, they actually upheld the use of disparate impact claims under the Fair Housing Act.
Wow, so that's a big win for fair housing advocates.
Huge win. It meant states could be held accountable for these segregative effects, even if they didn't set out to discriminate.
So round one to the fair housing advocates.
Well, there's a twist. While the court said, yes, you can use disparate impact claims, they also made it harder to win these cases.
How so?
They set a higher bar for proving disparate impact, which made future litigation a lot more complex.
A win, but with some caveats.
definitely.
It seems like this shift to LIHTC, this market-driven approach, is creating a whole new set of legal challenges.
Absolutely, and it goes beyond just the states.
Okay.
Remember that governing at a distance idea?
Uh-huh.
Well, that's where the second Texas case comes in.
Okay.
ICP sued the U.S. Treasury Department.
Hold on. The Treasury Department, what do they have to do with all this?
Well, remember, LIHTC is a federal program,
Right.
and the Treasury has a role in overseeing it, even if it's more behind the scenes.
Gotcha.
This case zeroed in on the Treasury's approval of bank investments in LIHTC projects. ICP argued that the Treasury's approval process, even though it seemed passive, was contributing to racial disparities.
So they were basically saying, hey, if you're rubber stamping investments that lead to segregation, you're part of the problem,
That's a great way to put it.
even if you're not directly making the decisions.
Right, and this case really highlighted how complex governing at a distance can be.
Yeah.
Even though the government's role seemed hands-off their actions, or in this case, inactions, still had big consequences.
That must have been a tough case to make.
Oh, incredibly tough.
Yeah, because now you're trying to hold the federal government accountable for seemingly passive actions, and it's got to be much harder to prove intent when things are less direct.
It is it is trying to prove discriminatory intent in this context is a bit like trying to prove someone deliberately spilled their coffee versus showing that their wobbly table caused the spill.
Okay, I like that analogy.
One requires evidence of a conscious decision to discriminate while the other focuses on the outcome, regardless of intent.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
This governing at a distance idea adds a whole other layer of complexity to fair housing litigation.
It does, and it makes us ask some tough questions about accountability in a time where the government's hand might be less visible, but their influence is still very real.
Feels like this case really opened up a can of worms, raising questions that go way beyond this one program.
Yeah.
What happens when we apply this idea of passive government actions and their impact to other areas of policy?
That's a great point, and that's exactly what we'll dig into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore how this governing at a distance thing connects to bigger historical patterns in housing policy and what it all means for the future of fair housing. It's like, those ripples you get when you toss a stone in a pond?
Yeah.
You get that small impact at first, but then the effects, they just spread out.
Okay, so how does this governing at a distance connect to those broader historical patterns we see in housing policy?
Right.
Were there other examples where a seemingly neutral policy ended up having a discriminatory impact?
Oh, absolutely. Think about how suburbs grew in the mid-20th century.
Okay.
Federal policies,
Yeah.
things like mortgage interest deductions, made it easier for white families to buy homes.
Yeah.
But then you had discriminatory practices like redlining that shut black families out of those same opportunities.
So even though the government wasn't building segregated neighborhoods directly, their policies were kind of shaping the landscape in a way that led to segregation.
Exactly. Those seemingly neutral policies about home ownership, they had this ripple effect, fueled white flight to the suburbs and concentrated poverty and disinvestment in urban areas.
And we see those patterns even today.
Oh, yeah.
That legacy of those policies in a racial disparities in wealth and home ownership.
It's undeniable, and it shows how passive government actions, even inaction, can have this huge impact on keeping inequality going.
Okay, so circling back to LIHTC, how has this understanding of governing at a distance influenced legal strategies?
Right.
If it's harder to prove intent, how do fair housing advocates effectively challenge these more subtle forms of discrimination?
That's the million-dollar question, and it means we have to get creative, think beyond those traditional legal approaches that focused on proving intent.
So what are some of those creative solutions? What tools are in the toolbox, so to speak?
Well, one way is to focus on the cumulative impact of a bunch of policies.
Okay.
It's not just about challenging LIHTC by itself, it's about looking at how it works with zoning laws, transportation policies, all those factors that contribute to segregation.
So connect the dots, show how seemingly separate policies can work together to create these patterns of inequality.
Exactly. It's like you're putting together a puzzle. Each piece might seem small on its own, but when you put them all together, you see the big picture.
That makes sense. Any other legal strategies gaining traction in this new landscape?
Another approach is to go after the process, not just the outcome.
Okay.
Like, advocates are starting to really scrutinize how state agencies are making decisions about where those LIHTC credits go.
Right.
Are they using clear criteria? Are there public hearings? Are there opportunities for community input?
So shine a light on those decision-making processes. Make sure they are equitable and accountable.
Exactly, and it goes beyond just legal strategies. Advocates are also focusing on building power at the local level, getting communities organized to demand more equitable housing policies.
So it's a combo of legal and grassroots strategies.
Absolutely. Litigation is just one tool in the toolbox.
Right.
Building coalitions, engaging with policymakers, and raising public awareness are all crucial parts of a comprehensive approach to fair housing.
It feels like this shift to LIHTC has really made everyone rethink how we approach fair housing. It's not just about going after the bad guys anymore. It's about understanding how systems and policies can perpetuate inequality even without any bad intentions.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to really unpack these complex issues and to think critically about how we can build a more just and equitable housing landscape.
And that's what we're trying to do here on the Deep Dive, giving you the information and insights you need to understand these complex issues and to engage in these important conversations.
We want to empower you, our listener, to be a part of the solution.
Because ultimately, creating a more just and equitable future takes all of us being informed, engaged, and ready to challenge the status quo. We've talked about the challenges, but what about the good stuff? Like if you were advising a community group that's trying to promote fair housing in this LIHTC world, What advice would you give them? Where should they focus?
I think the key is being proactive. Instead of just reacting to problems, communities need to be involved right from the start, shaping how LIHTC actually gets implemented in their area.
So get involved early, make your voices heard before those decisions are made. But how can they actually do that?
Well, first off, they can push for more transparency and accountability in that whole LIHTC allocation process, demand, clear criteria, public hearings, opportunities for the community to weigh in.
Hmm.
Don't let these decisions happen in the shadows.
So make sure the process itself is fair and equitable. But what about the actual projects? How can communities ensure that LIHTC developments are creating neighborhoods that are truly inclusive?
That's where things get exciting. Communities can advocate for policies that encourage mixed-income housing, push for inclusionary zoning that requires a certain percentage of affordable units in new developments.
So instead of concentrating poverty in certain areas, you're creating these more diverse, economically integrated communities.
Right. And it's not just about the housing itself. Communities can also push for investments in transportation schools and all those other amenities that make neighborhoods more attractive for everyone, regardless of their income.
It's about creating opportunities, not just housing units.
And that's where community organizing is so powerful. When residents come together and demand better for their neighborhoods, they can make a real difference.
Sounds like it takes a multi-pronged approach. Legal strategies, community organizing, policy advocacy. It all has to work together.
Absolutely. And the best solutions are going to be the ones that are tailored to the specific needs and challenges of each community.
No one size fits all,
Mhm.
but there are a lot of tools in the toolbox.
Exactly. And it's all about using those tools, strategically building those coalitions, and never giving up on the fight for fair housing.
Which brings us back to you, dear listener. We've dug into the complexities of LIHTC and how it's changing the game for fair housing. But the big question is, what will you do with this knowledge?
How will you use this information to make a difference in your community?
We hope this deep dive has given you some things to think about, some new perspectives, maybe even a bit of inspiration.
Because this fight for fair housing, it's not over. It's an ongoing thing, and we all need to be informed, engaged, and ready to challenge the status quo.
So keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable future.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
We'll catch you next time.